You can become an entrepreneur at any time, in your 30s, in your 40s, in your 50s, in your 60s. If you're listening to this and you're 35 and you're like, wow, I'm already 15 years into my career. I don't know if I'm cut out for it at this point. It's not too late. Time working on something that has an expected value of $5 million, they would say yes. But when you tell them it's a 95% chance of failure, but if it succeeds, that 5% that it succeeds, you get $100 million. I bet you most people would not take that bet. So if each time you start a business, you have a 10% chance of success, what that tells you is just keep going until you find success. And Branch was my 7th business. It wasn't the first. A lot of people look at successes. Yeah, that first business may fail. And it may take 5, 10 businesses for you to find one that works. But if you find one that works, then the outcome is really good. So ended up going to Stanford in California to do my MBA. I did not grow up in an entrepreneurial family. What are the chances that you succeed or fail? Right? So that's the probability component. But the other piece is, what is the outcome if you succeed or fail?
Hi, welcome to the Unlocking Journey podcast. Today, we are hosting Mike, who is the co-founder of Branch and Thena. In this episode, you will get to know how he navigated his journey from being bankrupt in 2013 to building a billion-dollar company.
Hey Mike, thanks for joining in today. It's great to have you on this podcast, and I believe with your journey, our listeners will learn a lot, and we want to actually unearth how you moved in your journey and develop some of the skills, some of the mental attitude, and now how you are looking at your vision for the future, right? So can you start with your background? How was your family background? How did you grow up as a child? And what are the kind of incidents that may have happened during that time that have shaped you as an individual and maybe have shaped you in terms of the decision making that you are doing, right? What are the kind of traits that you developed during those times?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. Thanks for taking the time to chat. So yeah, my background, grew up the son of 2 Cuban immigrants who came to the United States to find a better life. And me and my 2 brothers, and grew up in New Jersey in the United States and went to school there, ended up studying mechanical engineering. So I was originally a mechanical engineer out of undergrad, and then worked at a company called 3M, which makes things like Post-it notes and sponges. And during that time, ended up meeting a person Tyler, who became a close friend. And then he wanted to start a business. So we started a real estate business with a couple other guys and did that in 2008, which then we started a couple other businesses after that while working as engineers. And that's really when I got bit by the kind of entrepreneurial bug and decided that I wanted to try to do that full time, but I didn't have a network. I didn't really know too much about business. I was still learning and thought maybe an MBA would be a good way to build a network and knowledge and kind of a baseline skill set. So ended up going to Stanford in California to do my MBA. Was fortunate enough to get in. And during that time, I went with the mindset of, I want to start a business. And because I started a couple of businesses, but they were all kind of, they were small, and I wanted to start a tech business. I wanted to start something in like Silicon Valley fashion. And so ended up meeting a couple of classmates, Alex and Mata, who we ended up working on a project together. That first project that we worked on together for about 3 months was called Paw Print. And what it basically was Fitbit for dogs. It was a smart dog collar. This is 2013. It was a smart dog collar that you would be able to track your dog's activities and, see if they were maybe becoming more lethargic. You could even have GPS for location tracking. And we worked on that for 3 months, and we found that we worked well together, but that the market opportunity was not going to be very big. And that was one of the big lessons that we learned in terms of kind of making sure that you're assessing a big enough market and how to do user research and that sort of stuff. But since we worked well together, we committed to working on something over the summer. So decided to build an app, and that app ended up being a photo book sharing app, which was called Kindred. And it went okay. We definitely, had some good success with it. We got to maybe 100,000 downloads, and we were able to make some money from it, but we struggled with a lot of things around growth. We struggled with trying to grow it organically and compete against other big companies that were spending a lot on advertising. And so we ended up just trying to build a bunch of organic growth mechanisms, things like referrals and affiliates and blogs and our website and email and push notifications but we struggled with a lot of things around the user experience and increasing conversion, and then also measurement of the down funnel users. And so worked on that app for a year, but really what we ended up uncovering was an opportunity to solve the bigger need or the bigger challenge, which was this idea of deep linking, mobile linking, user experience, and organic attribution or organic mobile measurement. And when we stepped back one day and kind of thought through whether or not we wanted to continue with the app with Kindred, that was when we uncovered that, hey, maybe there's a bigger opportunity here. And so we didn't know for sure whether it was going to work, but we decided that we'd give ourselves 5 or 6 months to try to figure it out and see if we could get traction. And that idea eventually, shortly thereafter became Branch. And for those that don't know what Branch is basically a mobile linking and measurement platform for mobile or mobile apps. And we power about 100,000 apps out in the ecosystem. And we just basically sit as an SDK or an API inside of those apps to help with user routing, user experience, deep linking, measurement, attribution, that sort of stuff for these brands that have end consumer app or end consumers using their apps. And so that's been great. We started that in 2014, and the company's grown to over 500 employees, over 100 million in ARR, and doing well. So yeah, that's the high level there.
Yeah, thanks for talking the whole journey through. Can you deep dive a little bit into your background? As you said, like you are a child of 2 Cuban immigrants. How did that impact you as a child? How did their work ethic, like they must have had a really tough time during those times, right? How did that, from a mental standpoint, change you as an individual or shape you as an individual for future?
Yeah, I think an absolutely huge amount. I heard somebody say a quote recently, and it was something like they grew up with the 2 biggest advantages that they had was they grew up in a house that didn't have a lot, but what they did have was 2 loving parents. And I think that's spot on, right? And like growing up, especially immigrant families, a lot of times you don't have a lot. You're starting a life from scratch or building everything up. And it had a huge impact. It had a huge impact in, let's see, so work ethic for sure, and pride in work, and then definitely like the long view, and I don't want to call it selflessness, but the family unit as a whole. So let me touch on each one of those. So work ethic was huge, and it's one of the things I pride myself on. I think developed the work ethic that I have by watching my parents and seeing how hard they worked and how much they sacrificed. Because I look at what I do now and I say, I am not even working as hard as my parents worked. And, I can think of my dad working his butt off. I can think of my mom. She was working a full-time job, raised 3 boys, and then in her 50s went back to get her master's degree at night and on weekends. And in fact, at that time, I think she was working a full-time job and a part-time job. So she did so much. And all the way through retirement, she worked her butt off. And that was huge. Seeing that, I realized just how hard people can work and how that a lot of people just don't put in that level of effort. And so that definitely trained my work ethic. Related to that, they taught me to take pride in your work. And that's something that I see less frequently than I'd like, than I think the world could really benefit from more people taking pride in their work. I think it's easy to fall in the trap of just wanting to get work done. But when you take pride in your work, you end up doing a much more thorough job, and it ends up lasting a lot longer. And I think if more people did that, rather than just view work as something that they need to complete, but rather took pride in whatever it is they're doing, irrespective of what it is. And I'm not even necessarily talking about a job. It could be anything, right? I think it changes the way the world works. And I remember, like with my dad, he would do all the work around the house, and because we didn't have money to necessarily hire it out. And the amount of pride that he would take was he would paint something like the back of something or stain the bottom of a piece of furniture that nobody was ever going to see. And it wasn't about, is anyone ever going to see this? It was about taking pride in your work because you know that you did a good job. You know that you stained the bottom of that piece of furniture. You know that you painted the back side of that thing that probably no one will ever notice. And I remember he was working on something, and I asked him one day, like, why even spend your time doing that? And he goes, because 30 years from now, when somebody removes this wall and they see that I took the time and the energy to do this. They're going to appreciate it, and they're going to appreciate that. And they're going to know that this was done well and this was done right, rather than, I think when people cut corners, you end up finding out later, and it kind of, you can just tell when people haven't taken pride in it. So that's the first thing. That's the biggest thing. The other thing that I've really thought about in the last few years is my parents took a long view on the family unit, meaning they knew that their lives weren't going to be easy, but they were going to build up a life that was slightly better for the next generation. And that's the view I take as well. It's easy for, I think, a lot of people to think, how can I make my life easier? I don't think life is about making your life easier. I think your life is about maximizing the potential for your family unit. And that family unit could be your spouse and your kids. It could be future generations, 3, 4, 5 generations down the road, whatever that is. And so that's the way I view things as well, which is, it's not about how can I make my life easy? How can I maximize my life? It is, I will forego things or sacrifice things if I think that it will maximize the potential and happiness of the broader family unit, whether that be my mother, whether that be my brothers, whether it be my their wives and the kids, my nieces and nephews, whether it be my future generations, or just in general the family's generations. And so that changes the view, because it means, for me at least, it's enabled me to think longer term and not optimize just for what makes me happy. Those two things.
Yeah, that's great to actually hear. Can you now, I get that you had the work ethic from your parents and like working hard and all, right? But that also tempts people to go into a high probability kind of job. What I mean by that is, like, entrepreneurship is, as you know, right? It's a little bit, at least in the initial years, right? It's a little bit risky, is what it's treated as. Like, and I believe you actually worked in 3M, right, as a corporate employee, right? How did you first get into this entrepreneurship mindset? Like, where did it come from? And can you talk about that journey, that phase where you actually developed this belief in yourself that, okay, maybe I can start something of my own, and why did it happen?
Yeah, cool. So let me touch on a few. One is, how did I end up a business owner and get into entrepreneurship? The other is, this comparison between, you called it a high probability job. Yeah, a very safe, secure job that maybe increases your probability of not failing, but doesn't necessarily increase the expected value of the outcome. So I'll touch about what maximizes expected value. And then I can maybe talk about, or we can dive into it a little bit later, some of the attitudes and some of the principles or things that I've learned in terms of how to maximize your success there. Yeah. So I did not grow up in an entrepreneurial family. Like, it was not really a thing that we ever talked about or thought about. So when I was in, my early 20s, I kind of looked at entrepreneurs. I'm like, wow, they must have grown up in that family. It must be in their blood. They must have started, their first business when they were 10 years old. And there's certainly people that are that way, but I think there's a lot of entrepreneurs, I would say probably the majority, that didn't grow up that way, that kind of stumbled upon it in some other capacity. And so if you come from a family or a background where you weren't an entrepreneur, your family weren't entrepreneurs, your parents weren't business owners, that's okay. That's not a disadvantage. It will change the way you have to think about things, but you can be just as successful or more than somebody that grew up with that background. And so that, I think, is one of the first things. It's not, you can become an entrepreneur at any time, in your 30s, in your 40s, in your 50s, in your 60s. There are people, look at Sam Walton, who started Walmart, I think, in his 40s, right? Like, that. A lot of very, very, very successful entrepreneurs start it later in their lives. So if you're listening to this and you're 35 and you're like, well, I'm already 15 years into my career, I don't know if I'm cut out for it at this point, it's not too late, for sure. So what was my path? How did I do it? It was not intended at all. When I started at 3M as a 22-year-old out of undergrad, my thinking at that time, and even for a couple of years after, was, I'm going to work at this company for 40 years, right? Because that was the way prior generations had thought, especially here in the US, where you work at a company for 40 years, you get a pension, you get a retirement, whatever it is, and then you retire and you're happy, and that's it. I think the world shifted. I think the world has shifted where people realize, A, that's not the safest and most secure path and that companies, you can still do layoffs and you can still fail at that, and you can, maybe even be less happy. It's still a great path for the people that like that want that. That's totally fine. But for people that are thinking about entrepreneurship, I think there's many other options available to you. So it's just not, it's just not the only path, and it's not necessarily guaranteed success. And then B, you have less ownership. And I think companies these days are, pensions are becoming less and less common. And if you want to maximize your life value, if you want to maximize maybe your wealth, if you want to maximize your freedom over the long term, working in a job that's, minimizing risk is also going to, I think, minimize those other things as well. So anyway, I started at 3M, thought I was going to be there for 40 years, met this guy, Tyler. He's like, you ever think about starting a business? I was like, no, not really. I was like, I think we should do something. He was really eager about it. And we ended up getting into real estate. So we ended up buying a duplex together about a year later, which then we ended up buying a few more, buildings. And so we ended up with 13, 14 apartment rentals. And that was the first entrance into this idea of ownership. And it was really interesting because I compared that against my day job. My day job was, everything was very structured. If I did really well, it didn't matter. If I failed, it didn't matter. If, I delivered on a great project, there wasn't really a lot of impact. And I saw that the very little impact. So then we started, a couple other small businesses, a food vending business, a couple other things. And then I started over time to realize, like, I really like spending time on these other things. Like, they would get me energized. I would work all day as an engineer, and then afterwards I'd go work on these other businesses, and they excited me. And that's when I started to think, like, oh, maybe there's something here. Maybe I like the ownership component. Maybe I like the fact that the output and the impact is directly related to the input that I put into the business. And that was the first, after a couple of years, that was kind of the moment I was like, oh, maybe this is for me. Maybe I do want to do this. And as I've gotten later and later in my career, I've just realized how amazing it is to have that freedom and to be in direct control of your destiny rather than working at a bigger company. Okay, so that's how I got into it. How do I think about high probability jobs versus entrepreneurship? Yeah, so the way I think about value is a few different things. First of all, there's like, what are the chances that you succeed or fail? Right, so that's the probability component. But the other piece is, what is the outcome if you succeed or fail, right? And so often people think about, okay, they just think about the probability. If something's, they think about risk as probability. Risk is not just probability, is the product or the multiplication of probability times what the outcome is. Meaning, let's say something is like 90% chance that you're going to be successful, but the outcome is, 100 units, maybe it's $100,000 in savings, whatever it is. Like, that can tell you exactly what your expected value is, which is just the combination of those things. Now, let's say you say, hey, 95% chance that this thing fails. And if it fails, you don't get anything. But a 5% chance this thing succeeds. And if this thing succeeds, you get $100 million. Expected value would tell you that you take 5% chance that it succeeds times $100 million. So the expected value is $5 million. And I bet you if I told people, hey, would you spend time working on something that has an expected value of $5 million? They would say yes. But when you tell them it's a 95% chance of failure, but if it succeeds, that 5% that it succeeds, you get $100 million. I bet you most people would not take that bet, even though the expected value is the same. And that's because they're thinking about, oh, it's most likely going to fail. But they're not thinking about, hey, what if this succeeds? And so they're optimizing for minimizing risk or minimizing the downside of failure rather than trying to maximize or optimize for maximization or trying to maximize expected value. And that, I think, once I made that switch in my mind and I realized, like, expected value is the way to actually make these decisions, it totally changes the game. Because you're like, yeah, maybe having a business may have a 10% chance of success. But if you fail the first time, this is the big thing for me. If you fail the first time, that doesn't mean you're done forever, right? So if each time you start a business, you have a 10% chance of success, what that tells you is just keep going until you find success. And Branch was my 7th business. It wasn't my first. A lot of people look at successes and they look at like the overnight success or what they appears to be overnight. and they don't talk about the failures. And I try to talk about the failures just as much, if not more, than the successes, because I want people to know that there are 6 businesses before Branch. And so if you take 10% chance for each business, and then you fail at the first one, you keep going, you do another one, you do another one, you do another one, you do another one, you do another one. By your 7th business, maybe you've got a significantly higher probability because you've done it so many times. So it's just basic probability. So that's why I encourage people to just do something, get started, because that first business may fail, and it may take 5-10 businesses for you to find one that works. But if you find one that works, then the outcome is really good. So that's like the big thing for me. So let me pause there.
Yeah, I think that's super important, right? As you said, right? Even if we take that logical thing of probability and expected value, the probability actually adds up if you do it multiple times. If you have that thing multiple times, right? It adds up, and then the probability is like, I would say even high. Even if you take that, even if you don't think about the expected value, then only the probability part also increases if you do it multiple. If it ends up happening multiple times, right? And you actually learn from the previous one, right? You get the insight from the previous. So it's very important, I believe, and please correct me if I'm wrong, to learn and to actually use the compounding effect of learning on your next venture, and not stop at the trying and trying to do something big.
Thanks for watching the first part. The next part will be out soon.